Hey folks, Amanda here. Just a quick heads up that from time to time, the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast does include some adult language. So if you've got kids with you, you may just want to hold on to this episode to listen to a little later. Enjoy! Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell and the rest of my team here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. All right, Mark, so today we are going to talk about a topic I know absolutely nothing about: self-criticism versus self-awareness. And I say that in complete jest because I am the best self-critical person in the world. And so I'm absolutely excited for you to share some expertise that I know other people can benefit from. And selfishly, I'm sure I can benefit from as well.
I was going to say, I feel like this is something that we all have at least some level of awareness about.
I think so too. I mean, I think anybody who is really driven or, has really high ambition for themselves, I think we can all to some extent get ourselves into this trap between, am I being critical of myself or am I just being aware of where I have room to grow? So yeah, I agree. I think probably there's lots of people listening who are going to be able to find some resonance with this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So start us off. Self-criticism, self-awareness. What is it? Why should we talk about it?
Cool. So I'm going to set up the framework for what problems might this conversation help you solve as you listen in and kind of look at the takeaways or your nuggets, that one little thing that you're going to take home and apply today. So what are some of the problems that I might be able to solve? And so this is a lot from my personal experience and what has kept me stuck versus what has helped me go to the next level and the next level and the next level. And then sometimes I continue to keep myself stuck. Right. And then we go to the next. It just, this is a little bit of a story about the progression and some kind of a big mental mountain that I had to overcome in order to go from where I was 7 years ago, 5 years ago, to where I am personally today. And a lot of that obviously is correlating into our business and into our team and all those things. So that's a little bit of the framework. Problems that I'm hypothesizing that you, the listener who's listening to this right now, might be facing are things such as I'm stuck on something in my business because I don't feel like I'm good enough or I know enough or I have all the knowledge, right? I don't have all the intel to make a decision or move forward or take action. Maybe you're in sales and you hesitate to make sales because you don't feel like you have the right relationship or you don't feel like you deserve that relationship or you don't feel like you know enough to be confident in that sales conversation. Maybe you're the leader and you're stuck on something because you see people who are so critical of themselves that they're stuck, right? They get stuck on being critical of themselves. On the flip side of that, as the boss, as the employer, maybe you yourself are a tad bit critical now and then. I'm sure that never happens to you, but in case you know someone who does get that way, maybe there's a thing or two in here that can help you work past some of those issues with employees. That's just a small smattering of things that I think that this content and this topic will be able to help people solve. So how's that sound, Amanda?
Sounds good for me.
Okay.
Like I said, it might not be relevant to you, but it's the old asking for a friend type thing.
Right. And none of this, AKA all of this, has applied to me and continues to apply to me in some way, shape, or form, right? So Amanda, let's just dive in. Let's have a little conversation between you and me, right?
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, we had this. We hired a trainer to come in and help our team level up in our facilitation skills and our coaching skills and how we run classrooms, because our commitment is obviously to be our absolute best in the classroom and in coaching and create the environment within which people want to learn and can grow. So that was a a monetary expense and a time expense and all the other things that we incurred in order to help MJST get better. So in that, one of the things that we all got to do was try on some of these new skills that we were learning. So break it down, if you will, for us. What was Amanda's experience having to take on some of these new skill sets, this new level of awareness, like, oh, you can facilitate that way, or, oh, that's why Mark has been doing it that way all these years that I've known him. So walk us through, what was your experience, and specifically, what was your experience when you had to go on stage, so to speak, in front of our team with our trainer in the room, getting some firsthand coaching in the moment kind of experience?
Yeah. So I laugh because Mark knows this, but for those listening, it was a little bit of a rough experience for me. I went into this training like, oh, yeah, this is going to be awesome. I love to learn. I love to grow. The minute the rubber hits the road and I'm pushed out of my comfort zone, bam, it's like I fall apart. And I have thought a lot about that experience here in the last few weeks since then and what that all means. But I know my experience, and it's funny because I hear this from coaching clients all the time. They always say, right, you teach what you need to learn yourself sometimes. But for me, it was being put in that position of not feeling prepared or not feeling like, man, I'm going to step out here and do this perfectly. If anybody knows me, I have a hint of perfectionism in myself. So being put in situations that where I might show up imperfect or less than prepared to the T. That's usually the front I try and put forward. No one will out prepare me. That's really rough on me, and I will say that was one of many suffering moments in the Survivor's Guide to Thriving that I got to experience for myself, because it really was. It was a moment where all of really my shame and fear triggers came out to play. I know we talked about this in a previous episode, and I think it plays into this topic here about criticism today is I haven't had my shame gremlins come out that loud in a long time, referring back to Brene Brown's work on shame and vulnerability. Man, those negative voices, those gremlins in my head came out to play nice and loud. And so, yeah, I was deep in the self-criticism that day, and it was rough.
Yeah. Right. So walk us through just like one level, like I'm going to peel back just one more layer on that. Right. So there was this opportunity to go and, present your stuff and try on new techniques and whatever in front of the group. I fully knowing that I don't have them, I'm speaking in your terms now, fully knowing that I don't have them like on lockdown, fully practiced, like, they're not, it's not a well-oiled machine yet. Right. And yet I get to go try them in front of the group. So what is the voice in Amanda's head doing in the moment while you're stepping on stage and you're trying on the new things? Like knowing in your mind, like probably in one way you can like see it going well. Right. And then also knowing that you don't have the literal muscle memory to make it go perfect. Right.
Yeah.
And then being in front of your peers, right? Because that's a stressful situation all by itself. So what are the voices? What's the critic voice, which I'm guessing is what it is, right? What's the critic voice in Amanda's head saying at that time?
Yeah, that voice is shouting loud and clear, you are going to look like an idiot. They are going to think you don't know what you're doing. They're going to think you shouldn't be here, like loud and clear. Looking like an idiot is definitely one of my big fears, for sure.
And it's interesting, right? And even though, to give those of you guys that are listening in, like, even though we went through a whole setup, because our trainer is a very, very good facilitator, and he works really hard to create a safe space within which you can, you feel empowered to risk boldly and crave feedback, right? And step out in front and try things on. Like we do a really good job of setting that up in that environment. And still, right, and this even happens to me, like the voice starts to creep in. The critic voice is like, you're not going to get this right, you're going to look whatever, stupid, or it's just not going to, and then they're going to question you. Really what that means is you're going to question yourself. Right, and all the things. So it's interesting how, even though we have the ideal setting, like I can't think of a more ideal setting to be able to grow in the way we grew that week, right? But we still have those gremlins. We still have them. Yeah. Right. And if you're listening in, like, that to be true, like you've got that gremlin that sneaks in, that creeps into your brain, creeps into the back of your mind, like right before you're about to make a decision, right? Or right on the heels of something that somebody else said, or, pick any list, any level of different things that you go through throughout the day. Like there's that voice of doubt, right? The seed of doubt. And so one of the things I want to dive in today is like, where does that come from? Like, what is that all about? And we'll try to put that into a little bit of a framework, right? And then, if you think back, Amanda, so what, other than like, going on stage in front of your peers and doing something else, like what was it about going in? Because you've presented this stuff before and you do fine, right? You do quite well. So what do you think it was? Like, what was the trigger in this environment that allowed the gremlin to get louder and louder and louder as you went?
So for me, I think it was two things. So one, the parts of the training, the parts of the trying on new things that were most triggering for me were not the things that I understood and knew well. So for those listening, we had to prepare a piece of content to present to the group. And so that part, for the most part, was the easiest part for me, because you're right. I have presented it before. I know it inside and out. And that's my shtick normally, is those things that I know inside and out. I have no problem stepping in front of a group. And so, so what was actually most triggering were the things that I had no idea that were coming, that came out of left field. So that for me was the hardest, because preparation is so important to me. And preparation is like the armor that protects from the gremlins most of the time. And so the other thing, though, that was interesting to me, and I'm sure other people have experienced this, is that there is this split moment where you have this choice between criticism and awareness, between listening to the gremlins and letting logic take over. And I very much remember that point in that day where the gentleman leading our training said we were going to do something, and my brain went, nope, I'm not doing that. And from there, it was like a snowball rolling downhill, and it got worse and worse and worse, because in that moment, in hindsight, I see it, I decided that I was going to let the gremlins take over, that I was going to let that critical voice be louder than my logical voice. And so I think those are the two hardest things for me, is that it was the thing I couldn't prepare for that threw me off my game. And then when that came, it just built and built and built. And to the point where even those things I was comfortable with, I was struggling with, because the voice by that point was so loud that it's like, oh my gosh, I am losing this fight between emotion and logic in a terrible way, which of course you can always see in hindsight, like, oh, I could have handled that better. But in the moment, like, that criticism, that emotion is tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so I'm going to boil that back, right? Almost at the very beginning, when I asked that question, I was like, what was the trigger? Right. And it was like this new awareness that there are these new ways, this new stuff, these new things that I'm even learning about myself in the moment. Like, oh, right. Like now, like I've got this thing on lockdown. If I just walked into one of our regular classrooms and had to do this, I could do this right now. Right. But now I'm aware that it could be done better. And I want that, right? I want that to be true now. And so that triggers all this other shit right? Which calls the gremlins out of the closet, and then they come and say, well, you're a lot more safe over here, right? Like, forget that stuff, like put that on the shelf, like just stay doing what you do because you know you can lock this down. Right. And yet you have to like almost like kill off this old version of you in order to be able to morph in to this new level of awareness that you've now found to be true. Right. And we all go through this with different things. Now I can pick any role that you play in life. Okay. Whether it's at work, in your role at work, as a leader, as an employee, whatever, as a mom or a dad, as a brother or a sister or a husband or a wife or a son or daughter or a community member, or a volunteer, right? What we have, like I see people go out like literally giving their time away, volunteering. There's no need to criticize anybody who volunteers, yet they're their own worst critic. Because why? Because, well, like I could volunteer better, right? Or or I should have thought about this ahead of time or that ahead of time or whatever, right? And it's just it's a thing that we do as humans, and I'm going to get into a little bit of this hardwiring thing that we all have, but that's one of the things that we do. And as we get into something, right, I often see this. So as we start getting into it, we become aware that it could be this much better, and it's like, oh, I should have been prepared, right? Or I should have known that. Right. Because somewhere along the line, like you had some model of the world where it just seemed like somebody else always had it figured out this much more than you do. Does that make sense? Like, like I do this all the time. Like I'll run into somebody who is seemingly just like a little bit better than I am at a specific skill or thing or whatever, and I see that like, oh, like I should be that way. Like I'm good enough, or I should have known whatever it takes to like already have that skill set, that thing on lockdown. And we all have that little voice in our head that does all those things. So, yeah, go ahead.
I want to highlight, because I think it's a phrase I may have said, and you said it there, I should have, or you should have, from the perspective of that voice. Often I just want to like call this out for people. Anytime you're hearing the voice in your head say, hey, you should have, or I should have, like that's a massive clue that there's a shame trigger there for you, or one of these like lower emotions, especially shame. And because at least to me, there's like this inherent, you should have known to do XYZ, dummy. Like there's always you should have known, dummy. I don't know why. Like to me, it's like this constant minimizing of the voice. So I just want to call that out. Anytime you hear in your head, like, oh, you should have known, like, be careful with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's a perfect segue, Amanda, into what I want to set up for some real takeaways and things that I think you guys could probably put to use almost immediately today. One of the things that I really want to get out here in front of you is just to fully like accurately define the difference between criticism and awareness. They both have usefulness, and they both can certainly have a dark side too. Right. So I want to put a little bit of emphasis, a little onus on that. So criticism, according to Google, just before we got on here today, as I just went and looked for the actual definition, criticism is defined as the expression of disapproval based on perceived faults or mistakes. Right. So it's the expression of disapproval based on perceived faults or mistakes, right? So the only time that we're criticizing, we're being critical, right, is when we have a story in our mind that it was supposed to look a certain way or that it should look a certain way, right? And so we perceive that there's something wrong with it when it doesn't fully match up with what we thought the experience should be or what we thought whatever should be, right? So we perceive there to be faults or mistakes because it doesn't fully match up with the story that exists in our head. That's what criticism is, right? Awareness, on the flip side of this conversation, is the knowledge or perception of a situation or fact. Right? So they both have to do with perception, right? They both have to do with now I know something, I see something, right? It's the literally awareness is the knowledge or the perception of a situation or fact. Now that doesn't mean awareness is 100% truth. Right? It could just be like, now I'm aware, whatever, that I still think unicorns exist or something like that. And it's like a whole new level of, you can go and do a new story, but it's this knowledge or awareness or knowledge of or perception of something new, basically, right? That's when we have new awareness in our life. So we can be aware that we have growth opportunity. We can be aware that we have these things that maybe we get to go to work on about ourselves, our careers, our jobs, our relationships, our bodies, etc. Or we can be critical of the fact that I have work to do on myself, in my work, in my relationships, on my body, etc. Right? So you start to see the difference. Now, where do most people, Amanda, spend their time? Like when we bring them into the classroom and we start talking about ways that we might get better, right? Ways that we could possibly improve. And we go through some discovery moments. We do things like kickboxing to help people discover, like, oh shit, I'm out of shape. We do things like, journaling to help people discover, like, oh, here's a thing that I get to go to work on, or here's something that I like or don't like or whatever. But where do people tend to gravitate to between criticism and just sheer awareness?
Oh, way to the criticism ends, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so interesting. You actually just said, and we've talked about some of this languaging, purposeful languaging before, right? You said, I get to go to work on, which is such awareness language, because usually what we hear is, I need to fix that,
Yeah.
or I need to get better at it, which is so much more criticism languaging. So even, again, just listening to the minutia of the words you use, again, is a good clue onto which end of the spectrum you might be hanging out on.
Absolutely. So I want to dive into some at least quasi-scientific evidence and this is all just rote memory and from some self-study that I've done on the work of Dr. Richard Hawkins. And so Richard Hawkins, he's a researcher who's well known, and not as much in the U.S., but London, England, those kind of, he's got a huge following over in that part of the world. But he has basically, they've just discovered, I don't know if that's the right term, because I think they just sort of recovered the concept of calibrating different human emotions. Okay, so we think about what are the different types of human emotion that we experience. They came up with a tool with the ability to be able to calibrate the strength of human emotion based on what they call vibrational frequency. Okay, and so there are certain things on this scale. So basically, they came up with a scale, and they started calibrating different things all the way from human emotion on a scale from 0 up to 1,000. Okay. And as we calibrate human emotion and look at, like, how do different human emotions, maybe call them levels of consciousness, how do they rank? Okay. So that's what they're looking for. That's basically the test, to see how do they rank. Okay. And so here's what's interesting. So what they found, like at the very, very bottom, like at the base level, literally calibrating at 20 on a scale of 0 to 1,000, like 0 basically being death, right? So if you're dead, like that's that's right. At 20, right, is the human level of consciousness, the human emotion of shame. Right. And so that's interesting. And so, like, when I first read this, I read this over a decade ago, the first time, and I've recently gotten back into it in this last year and started really studying it because I want to create some new content around it. And this is really one of the first pieces that we'll create around it. And there will be more, I can promise you that. But it's just like, the awareness for me is like, holy crap, like, what do I frequently use? Like, which of these behaviors, emotions do I frequently use to try and get my kids to act a certain way? Right. And on the flip side, like, which ones did my parents use on me? Which one did your parents use on you? Right. Like, this is like the sharpest tool in the box because it gets used the most. Maybe it's the dullest tool. I don't know. Maybe that's why you got to use it a lot. But what do we use in order to try and get kids or even animals to act a certain way? Right. We use shame. We use shame to try to get them to do things the way that we perceive they should be. Right. And so anytime that kid or that dog or whatever shows up not doing the thing that I want them to do the way that I want them to do it, what do I say? Right? Shame on you. right? Shame on you for not doing better, for not knowing better, for not whatever, right? And this is something that, by the way, so it gets programmed to the human consciousness and subconsciousness, and it feels normal. Like you do this with your kids all the time. Those of you that are listening that have kids, you do this, and you probably never stop to question, like, should I be using shame in order to get my kid to grow up and act a certain way? Right. And I'm not saying, that is up to you. You get to do what you want. You're a kid. And yet I catch myself in these moments now and then, again, like shaming my kids because they didn't, because they shouldn't fight that way. Right. Or they shouldn't argue that way, or they should know, right, that right. Do you hear me? Like I get into like, they should. Right. And that's your yellow flag there, guys. That's your yellow flag as you start to look at, like, is this something that I want to do? Anytime I'm stuck in a way that I think somebody else or something else should be, I need to pause and stop and just question, like, how the hell do I know that they should be? Should they really know? Like, how do you know? Like, did you actually go in and plant the neural pathway specifically arranged so that that person understands that shoes go here in the way that you do at the level of importance, right? That goes to you. So next time their shoes are scattered all over the living room floor and they got sand from the playground spilling out onto the floor. Okay, that's the thing that happened in my house yesterday. Right? Next time that happens, like, just pause for a second. And as soon as like, you should know better, didn't they do that? Right? Is that what you're going to say? Or do you catch yourself and say, wow, like, was there maybe somewhere along the way that I could have, right, help them understand this better? Or is there a better way to approach it to help them learn better? Because obviously at this point, if she's almost 11 years old and they haven't figured it out yet, the shaming has obviously freaking failed. Okay. The shaming has failed. So there's, another way that we criticize is around guilt, right? So we use guilt, like, and you always have a very interesting, I want you to pull up some Brene Brown for me, if you would. So Brene has an interesting definition between shame and guilt, and I don't want to butcher it. Can you remember what that is? Yeah.
And I think this lines up with the correlation that on the scale you're talking about, right? Like shame is the lowest and guilt it's still low, but it's like a step up.
Yeah.
In Brene Brown's research, it basically with how they define the difference is shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad.
Yes.
Right. So there's a level of disconnect between who you fundamentally are and the actions that you take. And the reason why there's a little bit different leveling to those things is, again, when I can disconnect who I am at the core from what I do, it's always a little easier to change what I do than who I am. And so that disconnect, that's why shame is lower and guilt is just slightly higher up the scale.
Yep, absolutely. So, to really cut to the point here, and given the time that we have, the lowest 3 on the scale from 0 to 1,000 of all human emotion, the lowest 3 are shame, guilt, and fear, in that order. Shame, guilt, and fear. And, so here's something that's interesting. And this is just awareness that I've gained. And I start to see this as interesting now, the more I study human behavior and what forms a human, what creates a mind. And it really boils down to, like, we use so much shame, so much guilt, and so much fear on ourselves and on others. Right. And we literally use this. We use fear all the time. Like we with like discounts and deals, right? We drive human behavior by putting a perceived deadline, right? I can go to any store all the time and there's always something like 50% off every damn day. Right? But there's a perceived fear that 50% off could go away, on that particular thing that I showed up to buy that day. And we use fear, like with deadlines, okay, in the workplace as an example, like, oh, if I miss that deadline, shame on me. Right? That's a double whammy. That's 2 of them, right? All at the same time. So then the question becomes, okay, so let's put some awareness around this. So when I am doing those things, when I'm in a what I call a vibration or an emotion of shame and guilt and fear, what I'm most likely doing is criticizing myself or criticizing others or creating a critical dynamic within the relationship. Okay. And so like, yeah, if you don't get this to me by 4 o'clock on Friday, then whatever the consequence, right? Then I'm going to be mad. So we use fear to drive that. So that's a critical component or a critical factor, and not critical important, like critical, like I'm critical of you in that relationship, as an example. And then we do the same with shame. We shame people into it. We talk about that. And then we guilt people in, or I guilt myself, right, into these things. So these are ways that we're using criticism, okay, to drive behaviors. What I'm going to pose, right, to sort of start pivoting here just a little bit, is what if we were to start using awareness a little bit differently? What if we started to use the word, the idea of awareness, and instead of saying like, you should have known that, right, we flip it around and say, have you ever considered? Right? Instead of saying, you just don't make any freaking sense to me, I can't understand why you would do that. Instead of using a shame, guilt, or fear type sentence, why not say, help me understand that a little bit better, right? Or tell me more about why you chose that, right? And use it with an inquisitive voice instead of a shaming voice. Like there's a difference between tell me more about that and tell me why you did that. Right? And I can't even say it without a smile on my face as we're sitting here talking. So it's like, it probably sounds more harsh than that, right? So there's a difference. You have to use your intonation and things like that, but you start to see the difference between using criticism, right, and using awareness, right? Intelligent conversation, higher vibration conversation is really what I start to consider it. And so we will link up in the show notes the full scale of human emotion levels of, Richard Hawkins calls them levels of consciousness. We'll link those up so you can go and read them and dive in and get the definitions and get to know more of them on a short episode like this. We don't have a ton of time to go into each one, and I'll be creating some more training. It'll be available eventually in the Thrive Today app around each one and how you can leverage each one and those things. But for the purpose of today, I want you to start thinking about awareness, and I'll give you some new awareness to start considering things with a new lens, if you will, to start considering things through. As you climb up the levels of human consciousness, human emotion, okay, we go through things like guilt and shame and fear, etc. And we find ourselves eventually getting a little bit higher. We hit pride, right? So pride can be a very, very constructive human behavior. So we have our human level of consciousness. So we have pride in our country, pride in my school, pride in my community, proud of yourself, proud of your work, right? So there's a massively beneficial component to being able to utilize pride. And right there, that's kind of the highest end of those. I believe that's about the highest end of those that are, they're all useful to some extent. But as long as I'm using too much pride, right, or I can go too deeply, I can go to the dark side of pride. I can even use shame for good, right? But there's also a mostly dark side to it. All of these things that calibrate on Richard Hawkins' list below the level of 200 eventually become destructive behaviors. Eventually they become destructive. They have value, yes, but eventually they become destructive. So I want you to really, really understand there's a hard line between what's constructive and what's destructive. The line starts to shift when we get to the human level of consciousness of courage. That's at about 200. And so now I'm making a connection between what is and what could be. And when I make the leap between what is and what could be, now I'm actually expanding my consciousness. And that will always, in the long run, always benefit you, because this is no different. When I know that I need to go knock on the door of that business or that person in order to try and get business, I know that's scary. There's fear, there's shame, there's guilt, there's all my criticisms, all my gremlins come screaming out of the closet, say, don't do it, it's not going to work, you're not good enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you slam the door on that and you jump anyway, that's the moment when you use courage. And no matter what, even if it doesn't work, even if it doesn't turn out your way, you have grown every single time, no matter what. You've awakened. In our Survivor's Guide to Thriving Pyramid, we call it awakening. So you can't help but get better if you do courageous things. doing shit that scares you every single day, right? So courage is where it is. And then just the next level, right above that, is one where you really you get away from this whole idea of, it should have looked a certain way, or it needs to look a certain way, or I've got it wrong, or something like that. And you get into a space of what we call neutrality. Okay. So at the level of neutrality is when I sit here and I can see the things going on around me for what they are. On the flip side, right, if I'm sitting in a place of criticism, right, then I'm operating from a place of they should be a certain way. It should show up. It should go differently. It should go better. My team should have performed better. Last weekend, Adam Thielen shouldn't have fumbled that football. That was a big one on our team. So there are a lot of Vikings fans. That shouldn't have happened. That's criticism, right? Awareness happens for me more easily and more frequently when I can get to a place of neutrality. And I see the fumble and I say, oh man, he was trying so hard that he took his concentration off ball handling for 1 second, and it totally switched the momentum of the game, right? Or I see the employee who screwed up and I say, oh man, I remember when I was at that stage, and that was something that I did too, right? Or I see somebody who gets super critical or super frustrated in front of the room, and I can think about, oh, I remember when I was going through that too. And I start to see it for what it is, and instead of what my programming says it should be. And when you start operating from that place of neutrality, that place of I don't know, whatever. I see a person doing something stupid on the roadway, or I see my kid behaving a certain way, or I see one of my daughters fighting, right? That's a big trigger for a lot of parents. You see your kids fighting, and that's a huge, it's a huge trigger. It still gets me once in a while, but what I'm finding is on my journey is I focus on neutrality and wanting to live my life there more frequently. I notice that sometimes I just let them do it. I just let it roll. And why would I do that? Why wouldn't I intervene? You should, as long as they're not bullying and they're not calling each other really bad names or something like that, they're learning how to resolve conflict. And I see this as a crucial crucial part of the human experience. I have to learn how to solve my own freaking problems because mom and dad's not always going to be there to come save me. Right. So I see it as an opportunity to learn and grow, not an opportunity for me to be mean. Right. And if I start operating from a place of, Mark, you really should jump in on this, because if you don't, then what? I don't know. So these are some ways that we start to create awareness around, hey, there's this whole other end of the spectrum that's possible that most likely you didn't learn while you were getting the program put into your brain as a child, even as a teenager and a young adult. We don't think about these things. The world, by and large, as they calibrate it on this scale from 0 to 1,000, literally calibrates it just below that 200 mark, meaning that the collective whole of all these things is largely destructive. It's partially destructive, right? And so we're moving up. The good news is the planet is actually getting better as they, these researchers continue to see how it's doing, and they kind of calibrate what's the basic level of consciousness of human emotion on the planet ever has been. And it continues to grow, partially because we're helping people become more and more and more aware. Now, here's one little thing I want to have you consider, and you're gonna have to go and read some of the research, get the book to understand this. The book is called Power versus Force. Right? It's called Power versus Force by Dr. Richard Hawkins. This is pretty astounding. People who are operating at a level of neutrality and above. Somebody who's operating at a level of neutrality actually counteracts the negative energy of several 100,000 people operating at a lower frequency, operating at a lower level of consciousness. And so it really starts to, you can have a massive level of impact. And so I just want you to imagine this is, if I want work to go better for me, if I want things to be going easier for me, and I can only attest this to be true because this has been my experience, the more I focus on operating at higher levels on the scale of human emotion, the better everyone else around me continues to show up. The more amazing things that continue to happen in my business without me even being there. The more people that continue to come into us from a customer standpoint, even though I didn't make that phone call. I didn't make that Facebook video that brought that big lead in, into our business that allow us this new opportunity that we get to go bid on. I mean, these things will continue to happen. So that I have evidence from a personal experience, but look into the research and definitely study a little bit about what this could be, because there's more to it than you ever really dreamed or thought possible. But in summary, Amanda, and I'll toss it back over to you because I know I've been on the soapbox here for a good little while. At the end of the day, it really boils down to what energy do you want to live your life in? Do you want to be stuck in a cycle of shame and guilt and fear? Yes or no? It's just a black and white question. Would you? I mean, and I understand, until now, maybe until hearing these words today, you didn't know there was another option. But think about it. Do I want to be stuck in a cycle of guilt and shame and fear? And if the answer is yes, cool, move on. Go to the next episode. I get it. Okay. If you want something different, then consider, how do I live my life from a place of awareness that we could have more, we could do better, that we could discover, we could be in higher levels of awareness or whatever, in all the different things. If that's something that you want to look into, then lean into this. And we start looking at some of the tangible things, instead of you should have done it that way, help me understand, why do we go about it that direction? Why do we go that way? Right? We start to switch the languaging around. We call it conscious languaging. I get to instead of I have to. It's something I get to go do, and something instead of something I need to go do or go fix. And literally just changing the languaging around can have a massive impact on your life and the lives of those around you.
Good stuff.
So there you have it.
What stands out to me is how much making that shift, that we all sort of have to remember, is it is indeed a practice. And as someone who always wants to do things right the first time, we almost have to be careful of letting the gremlins trickle in as we're trying to get better, right? As we're trying to be more aware. There will be moments like my moment a few weeks ago where I know this stuff and still the gremlins sneak in, the shame triggers light up, right? It happens. And so I think what I have really taken away from this conversation, from reading a lot of the work of Brené Brown, who we've talked about here, is it really, to your point, Mark, comes down to those little choices in everyday moments and making a different choice than you might have otherwise. So instead of choosing shame, choosing empathy. Instead of choosing guilt, choosing perspective taking. It's small, tiny actions. It is not big, sweeping change. And so where the awareness to me comes in is being aware of when that moment has arisen, and you get a choice of which path to take. So I think that's a really powerful thing for us all to remember.
Right.
It's baby steps.
Yeah. It's such a good observation, right? I could just sit here and see someone say, I'm going to try this on. And then later on in the day, catch themselves in a new level of awareness about something that they frequently do. Right. And then I'm just I have no idea how to change this. Right. It's just those little, we call it Kaizen, right? Small, seemingly insignificant, never ending improvement, just little things. And rather than when you find yourself doing it in a way that you don't feel serves you anymore, rather than beat yourself up about it, just notice, right? The mindset is as simple as that. Now, the practice is not as easy. It's a simple concept, not easy to implement. But the simple concept is, I see that I do this thing and I don't necessarily like that anymore. It doesn't serve me anymore. Oh, that's how that shows up, right? See it for what it is. Don't beat yourself up about it. And if you can just find one or two of those things today, and another one tomorrow, or another one and another one tomorrow, then you'll start to get in the habit. And now that you have the awareness, you can't unknow what you now know. So if you've listened this far in the episode, you're screwed anyway. You might as well try it and just notice, just catch yourself, in wow, that's how that shows up. That's how that shows up. And rather than beat myself up about it, like, oh, I should have known better, I shouldn't have said it that way. I know one of the things I love about our team, this is, everybody has permission to call me out when certain strengths go into overdrive. And so my enthusiasm is probably my number one thing that goes into overdrive. And I get so fired up about things. I just want to tell everybody about it and like go on and on about it. And it's probably the one that gets me in trouble the most. And the other day, somebody said, okay, Mark, just pause for a second. Just curb your enthusiasm, literally is what was said. Curb your enthusiasm for a minute. We got to cover this base first. And I was like, and I sat back and like, I recognized that the old me would have been super ashamed for overstepping my enthusiasm boundaries in that conversation. And instead now, like, several years into this, I sat back and was like, oh, that's how that shows up now. And I was like, 30 seconds later, I was on with it. I was like, oh, that's how that shows up now. Now I'm more aware, right? And I just move on with the next best version of me.
Absolutely. Good stuff. And if you want more good stuff like this conversation, like many other conversations, all sorts of good resources, please make sure you jump over to the App Store or Google Play and download the Thrive Today app. That is #ThriveToday. Don't forget the hashtag or you won't find it. #ThriveToday and download that app for some awesome community, some really great resources, tools to help you track behavior change as you're on your own personal growth journey. We would love to see you over in the Thrive Today community in the Thrive Today app. So I just want to put that little plug in. Mark, good conversation. Anything else you want to add?
I'll just say this. If you're hearing this on your podcast app or Spotify or whatever pod launcher, whatever you want to call it that you use, then just go into the Thrive Today app. That means like if you're hearing this on some other medium, that it's also live in a post under our podcasts in the Thrive Today app. I would love to hear in the comments on there, like, what are your takeaways? Like, what is this new level of awareness around levels of human consciousness, particularly the difference between, criticism and awareness? Okay. How is this showing up? What's like one thing that you implemented today or learned as a result of this? Come post that up in the comments. Even if you do nothing else in the app, just come engage with the content. There's a ton of great stuff out there besides this one too. That's what I got for you. I don't know. Everything else is just surviving. It's your time to thrive. Let's go get it.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. On that same note, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjewelltraining.com. That's Jewell with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewell Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.